Good morning, viewers. This is Empty World podcast number 3. We're already on our third podcast. Today's episode is actually hosted by Ty. It's this subject. We're going to be diving into, I think this is saying called to the void. I kind of got a glimpse of it. But before we go into our subject for today, as always, Ty, how are you doing this week?
Good, man. Good. I had a great finish to last week. Wonderful weekend. And now I'm kid free, hanging out. I did some driving for Uber Eats this morning. Had a blast. Picked up some grocery orders. Picked up some food. Yeah, dude, living the dream. I feel good. I got a little bit of a cold. If I sound stranger than usual, I'm a little congested, but otherwise we chilling. How are you?
Makes you sound normal.
That's right.
I'm doing good. I mean, obviously this week just started, but last week was good. It was a very productive week. Got a lot of things done, a lot of graphics done, some programming done and coding. So last week was very productive. Very proud of last week. Yeah, but other than that, I'm doing fantastic.
Ooh, I officially started writing my new book.
Oh, nice.
I did.
Do we get a
This
sneak
one
peek
is
of the title?
No, only because I have a working title, but I'm not sure I'm going to stick with it. But it's a different direction for sure. So the first book I wrote, obviously a children's book. It's okay to feel mad. This one is definitely not for children. And it has a little bit to do with emotions, but a lot to do with anger and sadness and depression and hate. I'm excited though. It's going to be a huge passion project. So I'm stoked.
Awesome, dude. Well, I'm happy to hear you coming out with another book. Can't wait to advertise it again and talk about it. But yeah, today's subject is called to the void. And I think is the saying, and it kind of touches on a certain subject. I could be wrong. But I'm going to let you be the one to discuss that. I didn't really look that much into it, so it's going to be new to me. I'm going to be reacting for the first time. I don't know much about it. But so we're going to kick it off with Ty, and I'll kind of put in my 2 cents and feedback as Ty goes through his subject. Again, we like this to kind of be I bring something to Ty, and then Ty brings something to me, and then we kind of just ad lib and go on. These aren't scripted. So I never want these to be scripted. I want it to be real. So Ty, go ahead. What do you got for me today?
Perfect. Yeah, man. The Call of the Void. I'm excited. This is something that I've been interested in, experienced, thought about a lot in my life. And I'm excited to share it with you and everybody else. So it's super interesting. But before we start, I do want to give a huge trigger warning. This episode is going to contain discussion surrounding death, self-harm, and suicide. So if this is an episode that you'd prefer to skip, we totally understand. We'll catch you on the next one. And most important, if you are having feelings of self-harm or suicide, please reach out to someone. Don't keep it to yourself. That's the worst thing you can do. Talk to anybody. You can also call the National Suicide Hotline, 988 on your phone. Just dial 988 and someone will talk you through it. So please, you're not alone. You don't need to do it silently.
Awesome.
With that being said, we're going to dive in. So let me ask you this, Mason. Have you ever stood on a balcony, leaned over the edge, and then unexpectedly the thought just pops into your head, man, if I wanted to, I could just jump?
You know, I never had suicidal tendencies, so I'll start with that. But I mean, there's been a couple of times. So when I was younger, have you ever been to Niagara Falls?
Yeah.
Okay. And like I have very bad OCD, right? And so we were you get really close to the edge. You hear stories about people jumping in. I don't know how the statistics or how many people have done this accidentally or on purpose. But we're standing on the edge, and you were like maybe a foot, 2 foot. I don't know if it's bigger now, away from this railing and then the falls. And you kind of look down, and you kind of have this feeling like this has happened to people. If I were to jump in, what would it be like? What would it feel like? Would I die on impact? Would I drown? Would I be in the rapids, carrying yourself away. Not necessarily a suicidal thought, but just thinking of what it would mean and what would happen. And then also, when I was a little bit older, we had this thing in um, Michigan called Suicide Cliff. A lot of people either fell, died. I mean, it was out in the woods. Um, and I was right up on the end of it, just checking it out. Kids, being kids, you want to see and check out, and you have these stories, and you kind of look over and you kind of imagine what that might have been like, and what the accidents or the thought process was from people doing.
That's huge, right? Like you're playing the tape through as if like not like you want to, but like what if, right? And you can play it through. And I know for me, when I have those moments, my heart rate goes up. I feel like kind of that sinking feeling in my stomach, right? Like you get a physical reaction as a result of this thought process that's going through. Um, or maybe like me, you've been driving down the road, and the thought has suddenly crossed your mind, man, what would happen if I just swerved into oncoming traffic? Um, or you've been doing the dishes, and I'll turn the garbage disposal on and think, man, I should stick my hand in there, right? Like it's these crazy thoughts that just in an instant snap into your head, completely separated from any sort of suicidal ideation, often separated from depression. It's not like an intent, it's just this playing through of the tape, right? What would happen? Well, it turns out there's a name for this feeling. It's called the call of the void. And the French even have a term for it called l'appel du vide, which translates to the call of the void. And it's something that hasn't really been studied very much, but there was a study done in 2012, and then there was a later one done in 2020. Um, I looked primarily at the study in 2012. They ended up surveying 431 undergraduate students, and they found that just over 50% of those who had never had suicidal thoughts had experienced aspects of this phenomenon at least one time. And for the students who they called them lifetime suicide ideators, essentially just people who have had suicidal thoughts, 75% of them reported experiencing this phenomenon as well, this call of the void. So the study essentially showed for the first time ever that there was not an exclusive link between suicidal ideation and then experiencing these sudden thoughts of self-harm or suicide. In other words, it's not exclusive to those with thoughts of suicide, and it can occur in people who have never had suicidal thoughts, which is crazy, right?
Yeah, I actually can understand that from a certain perspective, right? And there's always there's always this thought of what if, right? And whether it be Niagara Falls, whether it be Suicide Cliff, whether it be what would happen if I drove on oncoming traffic. There's thoughts, right, that just pop into your head, and they're called intrusive thoughts. And it's some people just get this feeling of, and it's just a thought, it just pops in of what would happen if I did this. Um, who would this affect? Um, who would miss me? If I could stare down at my own funeral from an out of body experience, how would people be reacting? I think some of those thoughts kind of pop into your head because I mean, I'm not suicidal at all, but it's like you'll get this thought sometimes that if I were to go, how would people feel? How would that affect others? How what exactly would it affect? Um, like what I think this is a very common thing in the world today is is there another side? Um, what does it look like if you die? Right? Is there heaven? Is there hell? Is there nothing? And it's a constant thought process that you think of that can contribute to those pictures, those images, those thoughts.
Totally. Yeah, my 6-year-old has unfortunately experienced the passing of a family member unexpectedly. And it was due to suicide. He's 6, he doesn't know that. But since that happened, he has had a very keen interest in death. And he asks me fairly often, more often than I would like anyway, right? He asks me what happens when we die, right? Or one morning we were walking to school, it's like 8 in the morning, and he just says, "Dad, what are all the ways you could die?"
Ooh,
And those are
ooh,
those are really challenging things
yeah.
to answer as a as a human, right? Let alone as a dad talking to his 6-year-old son who gosh, I mean, they just grow up too fast, right? I don't want him to have to worry about that stuff. So it's a challenging subject for everybody, and I feel like as the world changes, oftentimes we're getting exposed to death and suicide and a lot of the more graphic parts of life so much earlier, right? I mean, I remember when his grandpa died, his concept of death at that point a couple of years ago was, well, what happened? Did he just fall down and have X's on his eyes?
Oh wow.
Like he has no concept. And then fast forward to today, he's like, you could get shot, you could get stabbed, you could fall down. Like he's got all these methods, right, in his head. He understands so much more about it, and it's a scary thing.
Uh, yeah, I mean, I could see that, and I think the biggest, how do I explain it? The biggest common denominator in that is, um, well, let's look at school. So you're what are they taught now? Like when we were kids, it's like get under your desk for tornadoes, right? Um, Now it is they have gun drills. They have you know uh, scenarios that play out in school where there could be harm to others and what to do, where to hide. When the situation comes up and you're involved, how to take care of it, and it early on ingrains this thought of this is real, it could happen to me. And then they're exposed to scenarios or things that have happened that start giving you that thought process at an early age.
Totally, totally. And I think about screen time in video games, and I certainly don't want to debate whether or not there's a link between video games and future acts of violence. That's been hashed and rehashed from the time you and I were 6 years old. Who cares? But nobody can argue that there is a level of exposure to violence that is brought on by screens, right? Brought on by video games. Whether or not 6-year-old Johnny's going to go on to act him out, none of my business, right? But 6-year-old Johnny certainly knows about it as a result, which is scary, which is scary. So let me ask you this. So, um, if you had to guess, right? If you had to wager a guess, what do you think that the lead researcher in the study on the Call of the Void, uh, what do you think? What kind of conclusions do you think they would come to? Like, what's causing this phenomenon? What's going on in our brain that leads us to have these thoughts?
Um, I mean, being somebody who's been through therapy, I mean, I guess it differs from person to person, but if I were to say, um, what brings on the leading cause would be self worth or value, maybe.
Sure, sure. That's a perfect guess. So, um, but it's dead wrong, according
Okay.
to the lead researcher. But again, this is not something that's been very well studied. And without being able to tap into our brain, right, in a way to read the way the the neurons are firing, I don't know that we'll ever truly have an answer to it. But what the lead researcher suspected was happening was it could actually be a person's self-conscious attempting to encourage a greater appreciation of what it feels like to be alive. So almost a survival instinct, right? Be aware of the danger, feel the danger, play through the danger in your mind, so much so that your heart races and there's no way you are letting go of that railing, right? Almost a survival instinct. Um, and the studies seem to indicate that the Call of the Void could show that someone has a higher than average degree of sensitivity when it comes to experiencing and interpreting these internal cues that happen in our brain. They even titled the study, "An Urge to Jump Affirms the Urge to Live, an empirical examination of the high place phenomenon," which is what they called it. They called it, we call it the call of the void, l'appel de vide. They called it the high place phenomenon. I think that's like the clinical definition of it, the high place phenomenon.
Uh,
Um,
yeah, I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
I think it's a good subject, by the way.
Thank you.
I think that brings there's a lot of different things involved in that, and that's a major one. And I think that is something that should be studied further, especially in today's society and the level of people that have mental disorders. And I also think it kind of goes back to, um, we adrenaline junkies. I guess you can say it kind of plays into what you just said. People live for the adrenaline, whether it be um, street racing, right? Where it's kind of like that. Am I getting caught by cops? Am I going to be in an accident? Like maybe an artist, like musician, right? Like the adrenaline of the crowd, where as in somebody might not typically be the person to jump off stage, but you kind of feed into that adrenaline and the presence of other people. Um, and you would do things that weren't necessarily something you would do, but the adrenaline thought, the whatever it may be in your mind pushing you to live off adrenaline. It's like kind of like people getting serious accidents, right? And they get broken bones everywhere, but they walk out of that car if they're alive, right? And they start walking around, they start yelling, and they're upset. And then when they get to the hospital, like the adrenaline wears down, and then they realize like, oh damn, my leg hurts really bad, my ribs hurt really bad, and they didn't really feel it in the moment, but it was sheer adrenaline.
Totally. Totally. So I think about, what they concluded was the cause of these thoughts. And obviously, they were focused predominantly on these thoughts occurring with people who had otherwise not had any sort of suicidal ideation in their life. Personally, without getting too much into the weeds, I've struggled with anxiety and depression pretty much my whole life. And I've been at that point, right, where it really does feel like a jumping off point, right? Pun intended. Um, and so we mentioned the simple things like the garbage disposal or driving in oncoming traffic. I've pictured, man, just swerve into a tree, swerve into a wall, step in front of a moving car, jump off a cliff. What would happen if I stay underwater until I lose consciousness, right? Or even as simple as, you ever been driving down like a dark road and you turn your headlights off, see how long you can drive with no headlights, right? I think we've all done something like that. Um, or maybe I'm the crazy one, I don't know.
I
But
mean, I've done the you're in the middle of nowhere, and you should have your high beams on, but
mhm,
you just have the regular. You can't see more than um 5 feet in front of you. I mean, in Arizona, for example, we have haboops, right? And sometimes they're really bad. Headlights don't mean anything. Um, wind wipers don't mean anything, right? Windshield wipers, but you're still going 45.
right.
And the thought process really isn't safe. It's I'm still gonna get to my destination.
Right. Well, if you've never driven, through the forest on a windy road in the middle of the night and turned your headlights off and seen how long you can go before your stomach says, "Turn them on. What are you doing?" I bet you'll try it next time.
We don't have woods in Arizona, but
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, you got to look for them. That's for
but
sure.
but there are extremely dark roads, especially when
Definitely,
you're out of the city. Yeah.
totally. Um, and I can think, obviously, again, I have dealt with anxiety and depression. I've been at that point, and I've experienced these thoughts at that point. But I think what's important to differentiate is that I've also experienced these thoughts when I'm happy, right? When I feel great. Um, and it is a scary thing to feel that physical reaction, that stomach dropping, the heart rate increasing, the almost nauseous feeling that I get, happy or sad, when I think about, okay, what would this look like if I stepped in front of this car as it drove past me going 50? What would happen? What would my friends and family say? What would my funeral look like? Would I go instantly or would it be slow and painful? You play out that whole tape in a matter of seconds, and man, I feel it. I feel it in my core, and I feel it to the point where I'm stepping back to the other side of the sidewalk thinking there's no way in hell I can do that, you know? So when they conclude that it's some, a warped survival instinct coming from our brain saying, feel alive so that you can stay alive, um, I mean, I think they're onto it. I can really relate to that. And again, not studied super much. I didn't find any data as far as people who've experienced this feeling and then had an impulsive act on it. And obviously, that would be something that's very hard to study because I think for the majority of those people, we would not be able to ask them after the fact, "Hey, was that impulsive, or had you planned that?" Right? So it's hard to say, and we may never know the answers. Um, I do want to be super clear, though, right? Again, um, I'm not suicidal. So for anybody watching who's concerned about me, um, I've struggled with it, but I'm doing everything I need to be. I'm in therapy. I'm on meds, and there's nothing wrong with those two things. So if you need those, get those. When I have these thoughts, they can also come from a place of absent of suicidal ideation, minding my own business, and boom, there it is, right? I found that when I was researching this, it's such a prevalent idea that I came across this healthline.com article, and it was literally like a Q&A article called Demystifying the Call of the Void, right? People who are like, "Oh my gosh, I'm experiencing this. What do I do? I got to figure this out because I think there's something wrong with me," right? And they're explaining, "No, there's nothing wrong with you. This is a normal phenomenon. It doesn't mean you're going to act on it. It doesn't mean you're necessarily depressed or having suicidal ideation. You're just alive," right? Um, and then I started looking on Reddit, right? There's tons of examples of people who've experienced this. And I even found one story of a gentleman who did act on it, um, although he was struggling with depression. So I'm sure that fed into his decision to act on it. But I quoted him here. He said he was super low point with depression, driving and swerved into oncoming traffic. It was late and not a ton of cars on the road, so I think I was in the other lane for a second or two when I heard horns, and the horns reminded me that there were other people I'd hurt. So thankfully, I was able to swerve back and go on about my life as if it hadn't happened. I felt terrible about it, but I think about it a lot when I'm driving alone and will always resist the void now, thankfully. That's what he says. So again, obviously he was dealing with depression, um, but the idea that this can happen in anybody is absolutely crazy.
Yeah, I like to think that despite what others may feel, that these mental health thoughts, intrusive um, or otherwise, is very normal um, chemical response in your brain for um, that typical situation, whether it be called the void, whether it be anxiety, whether it be depression. Like anybody who's having issues listening to this, if you're having these thoughts, I highly recommend having somebody you can either talk to that's close to you that has a different mindset, or seeking additional um, points of view from a therapist. Sometimes these are brought on by chemical issues in your brain. And I'm very aware of that because I've been tested and I have very low levels of serotonin, which is um, that it essentially makes you happy. It's the happy thoughts, right? It's the um how much it releases is how happy you can be. If you have issues with that, it affects your overall mood, your happiness, your energy. And I take medications to increase serotonin, and to kind of level me out. Um, but I had to, like, I didn't recognize um, that's what was happening, and I was medicated for it. And that's okay to be medicated. And there's a lot of people that old school that think, um, oh, do yoga, or you know, um, like, just don't do that. Don't think about it that
Just
way.
be happy.
Yeah, just be happy. Like, why do you have to think of it negatively? And it's not a forced thing. It's something that uh is just in your mind. Like when I was 13, 14, um, that's when my OCD triggered. I would go down. I was the typical, like, I watched a movie about this guy who had OCD, and it kind of like I really closely related because there's not many movies on. I think it had Jack Nicholson in it. Um, but like I would be in my bed, um, and I'd say about 20 times a night, if not more. I'd go downstairs and check the stoves because we had gas stoves, make sure that they were turned off, make sure gas wasn't leaking, to make sure the front door was locked, to whether it was summer or winter, because I lived in Michigan, I'd walk outside in my bare feet and check the fence to make sure the fence was shut. I'd go upstairs knowing that I already checked it, but within 5 minutes, I'd find myself back downstairs to check those. And it got to a point where my OCD was so bad and I got tired of walking down the stairs, I started sleeping on the couch in the living room of my family's house. And you could call that just being protective. I mean, maybe that's some people's initial thought processes. You just really care and make sure that everybody's safe. But no, like if my dog were to escape from the backyard, he's chipped, right? He has a thing on it. He would be found, right? Um, Statistically speaking, when I was a kid, if your door was unlocked, how many people would actually walk into a home back then? It is, statistically speaking, was very low. Um, the gas being left on, right? That's actually common, I think. Like people don't turn it all the way off or whatever the case may be. We didn't have any kids. Like, I have like those little things on my stove now, so you can't turn them because I have kids. Um, but it's always that thought process of what if, right? And if I don't check it, and those are when you say call it the void, right? And you're kind of like having these moments. It was kind of like my thought process in the moment. What if it happened? And then you dread on it and you're consistently checking. um that was my OCD and my intrusive thoughts, and I think that's what led to my continued OCD, led to depression, anxiety, mood swings, which are all now treated. But it's that intrusive thought, and they come in many forms.
Totally. It's like and it's like a cycle that feeds itself, right? So, you know, you have the obsessive thought that what if the back gate is unlocked, right? So then you have the compulsion, I better go lock it. I better go double check it, right? And then you check it knowing it's already locked, and then you have that feeling of, why did I just check it? I already knew it was locked. And then that feeds your anxiety, feeds your depression. At least for me, right? Like I was diagnosed OCD when I was really young too, and a lot of my OCD had to do with numbers and counting and making sure things were even. But to this day, if I'm driving down the road at night, I probably check to make sure my headlights are on a dozen times.
Yeah,
I mean, they're automatic. I don't touch them, right? But I'm driving down the road, I check. A few more miles later, I check. A few more miles later, I check. Right? It's just this compulsion to make sure my headlights are on. It's insane.
I think I got better with age, right? Because now on my phone I have apps, right? And um I have an August lock on my door. I don't know if you're familiar.
Yeah,
But when I come in the house, within 2 minutes, my door auto locks. It'll know me on my phone, notify me on my phone, door is locked. Um, it will notify me if the door unlocks. So if my wife comes home, if I have my phone on me and I pull up in my driveway, the second it hits Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, it unlocks my door. Go inside, shut the door, it auto locks within 2 minutes, and it always notifies me. And for me, that kind of it settles me a little bit.
totally. It's
Um,
like it's almost like, we don't necessarily lose the obsession, but we learn to manage the compulsion, right?
right, and you can check it from your phone, right? Like I'm laying on the couch, boop boop. Okay, that's locked. My garage door is closed. Um, like I have a ring camera in my backyard that faces a fence, so I'll know if my fence opens, and I actually have a lock on it too because in Arizona you just never know. Because dog theft is really big out here. Um, but like I have all these things. Like I even have a smart stove. Like it's on my phone. It'll let me know if something's running, if the oven's on. Um, like I have like this little connected device that tells me. But when I was younger, I had this thing where I used to, when I checked the stoves, each one, it would be off and I'd count to five with it being off. And I'd move on to the next one, the next one, the next one. And I'd do the same thing with the door. I'd hold on to the lock button to make sure it was locked, count to five. Same thing with the fence in the backyard. And I'd still go up to my room and I'd be like, in my head, I counted to five. It was done. And then within 5, 10 minutes, it was like, did I get to five? Um, and then you go downstairs, you start checking all over again.
Totally. Totally. And this is a great segue because, when I was researching this Call of the Void, it led me to something called harm OCD, which apparently they figure that this phenomenon falls under, right? Um, and I had never heard of harm OCD. Obviously, I'm diagnosed OCD. You're obviously familiar. Have you ever heard of harm OCD?
Uh, that one I haven't heard of. No.
I hadn't either. Apparently it's a common subtype of OCD that causes intrusive, unwanted thoughts, images, or urges about harm to oneself or others. So that's the obsession, right? The O in OCD. So in general, thoughts of harm obviously should always be taken seriously, but that makes diagnosing something like harm OCD especially challenging and scary, right? Because okay, what is the motivation behind my self-harm thought? Am I depressed? Am I suicidal? Or do I suffer from OCD? Right? There's a distinction, and sometimes it's very hard to make that distinction. But if it is harm OCD, these people are not more likely to harm themselves than anyone else, right? It has nothing to do with following through. It's all about the obsession in our mind. These folks view the intrusive and unwanted thoughts often as an indication of a desire to act, which then fuels anxiety and drives compulsions aimed at eliminating this fear, right? So, for example, if somebody has an obsession about um, hurting themselves by using a sharp object, right? They might remove all the knives from their kitchen out of fear that they can't trust themselves, and that would be the compulsion part of the OCD, right? So they obsess about this image or this story in their minds of what that would look like, and as a result, out go the knives. Um, these compulsions also can be completely invisible, which I had never really thought about, right? And it all in your mind. So, for instance, um, okay, so I've experienced this, right? I'll give an example. So, um, I think it's challenging to talk about, but I think many parents would relate to this. You have your young child, they're crying, they won't stop, and you're reaching the limit of your patience, and you love your child. You don't want to hurt your child. That's the last thing you want to do. But the thought crosses your mind, God, I could just chuck this kid, right? Like, God, I could just remove this kid from my person, right? Um, so then in my mind, I may be sitting there thinking, I love my son. I love my son. I love my son. I love my son. And that can be the compulsion too, right? Trying to counteract this intrusive thought because I could be afraid that I'm going to act on it, right? And it's such an interesting rabbit hole, right, to dive down into, to see how all these things that occur in our life can be so like interwoven and connected, right? It's something as simple as wanting to stick my hand in the garbage disposal out of nowhere can be related to the way I parent, or the way I think, the actions I take. Um, these things can be debilitating, right? All forms of OCD can potentially become debilitating and even life threatening when they're left untreated. And here's one big reason why OCD tends to fixate on what is most important to you, right? So, like you were talking about, the safety, the security. And I'm sure, and we don't obviously need to dive into your personal life, but I'm sure that, there is probably a root cause of why a lot of your compulsions had to do with safety and security, right? I know for me, a lot of my compulsions today are born out of my fear of abandonment, right? It's a counteraction of the thing that is most valuable to me. It's a protection, right? I do not want this to happen, therefore I'm going to do this compulsively. In the specific case of harm OCD, you may value being caring, loving, and responsible above all else. So as a result, the OCD latches on and causes you to have obsessions and compulsions in opposition to that core value, which then leads to intense anxiety. How can I be absolutely sure that I won't act on these impulses? That the impulse I just had to yeet my child, right? Do I secretly in the back of my head want to do that? Right? And the answer obviously, according to the studies, according to statistics, the answer is no, right? OCD is just something that happens with the chemistry in our brain, right? And you said earlier, you said something really important. You said these thoughts are normal, right? And I think sometimes, I know for me, I confuse normal with healthy, right? And I think, um, I'm having an unhealthy thought, so I must not be normal. The reality is, you can have normal thoughts that are also unhealthy, right? It doesn't mean that it's not a normal thought, and it doesn't mean that we have to act on it, right? And on the opposite end, I can have very abnormal thoughts that might be healthy, you know? That's why I know for me, it's important that I have a therapist and a doctor who I can trust, who can help me weed through some of those things.
Okay.
Um, Now
Yeah.
that is all super heavy stuff. Um, I'll let you finish that, and then I want to move on to a palate cleanser so that we don't live in the heavy stuff. So
Okay.
go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, mine is always, you know, I guess you can call it the what if factor. Um, a lot of my anxiety stems from, what if this were to happen? Um, uh, would I be able to take care of this? My wife's out. What happens if something happens to her? What happens if something happens to me? Um, and it's always playing in my head, what if, right? And you kind of self sabotage a little bit. And you're always second guessing, like, things that are out of your control, right? Like, what if this happened and we would be in the red, like we wouldn't know how to afford this or afford that. It's a necessity because something in my head popped in where something could go wrong. And there isn't something telling you that it can't, because it can, and that presents a feeling of anxiety.
Totally, totally. And I think, like, I know for me, I have a background in 12-step recovery. And we could dive into the motivations behind a lot of these anxious thoughts. We could spend hours on that, right? But I know for me, um, my anxiety, my what ifs, those are all born out of one thing, and they're all born out of fear. right? So what am I afraid of? I'm afraid of, dying before my kids or before I see my kids grow, right? I'm afraid of dying in a car accident. I'm afraid of somebody breaking into my house and shooting me. I'm afraid of a meteor falling on my house, right? It's so important for me to constantly remind myself those all can't happen, right? I can't die in a car accident and get shot and get crushed by a meteor, right? And the likelihood is that none of those will happen. So, what is a more valuable use of my time in this moment? Worrying about those things or focusing on what I'm doing right here, which is an amazing podcast, right? That staying in the present moment and recognizing, like, okay, I'm afraid of 100,000 different things in my life. They all possibly can't happen, right? It would be impossible for every scenario in my head to play out. They all counteract each other, right? They're just not likely. Um, but if I stay in the moment and face what I'm actually facing, and then tomorrow face what I'm actually facing, then now I no longer have to worry about 100,000 things. I just have to worry about one thing, right? I just got to make sure I'm doing a podcast to the best of my ability. And then I got to make sure I'm streaming on Twitch to the best of my ability. And then I got to make sure I'm, eating tacos tonight for dinner to the best of my ability. Um, I have a way to be free of that fear, and which ultimately then leads to a reduction in the anxiety, right? But again, having outside help, having medication, having therapy, there's nothing wrong with those things. Those things are, I mean, I'm very active in therapy and I am very active with my medication. Um, I could not have gotten to the place I'm at now if I wasn't kickstarted by medication and therapy, right? Because there's times in my life where I am so overwhelmed by fear and anxiety or so overwhelmed by depression that it's impossible to just stay in the moment. I can't. I physically can't, right? Like you said, it's a chemical imbalance in my brain that has to be treated first. So, I say, oh, stay in the present, you'll be happy. Do yoga, you'll be happy. Start with what you need to start with, which again, for me, medication, therapy. But yeah, man, that is the call of the void in a nutshell. Lapel de vide. We have these irrational, out of the blue thoughts. They trigger our fight or flight. They trigger the anxiety in us, and then obviously some of us take that anxiety and warp it into OCD. Some of us Google our symptoms on WebMD to figure out if there's something wrong with us. Some of us go to therapy to figure out why we want to hurt our kids. And the reality is, it's all totally normal and it happens whether you're depressed or not, which is crazy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that is all heavy. And I don't ever want to leave. I don't know about you, but I don't ever want to leave the podcast feeling like, man, what a downer of a subject, right?
Hey.
Um, and so I learned this from another podcast that I listened to, and they always do at the end somewhat of a palate cleanser, right? Something that should lighten the mood just a touch, and maybe people who are listening will feel slightly better about listening to our podcast by the time they leave. So what I started looking into next was where the call of the void exists in pop culture. So I went on Spotify, typed in "Call of the Void," and I found something like 9 different songs with "Call of the Void" in the title, right? With titled "Call of the Void." Some of them I recognized, some I didn't. But here's a list of some of the artists. So Devin Townsend has a song called "Call of the Void." The lyrics go, "Take a walk down by the river, revelations, paranoia, and the thoughts that pull you under, are they calling?" So obviously very much "Call of the Void." There was a band called Imminence. The song was pretty decent. "Staring down into the gates of hell, holding on to the bitter end. Do you hear the siren call of death? This is the deep and dying breath." Super heavy. Woohoo. There was a band called Mutoid Man. "We must avoid Call of the Void." Those were their lyrics. And then I went on Spotify and I searched Lapel de Vide, right? The French translation of it. Several more songs. One of which I was very excited to find. There's a band called Black Tongue. I know them pretty well. And they have a song called Lapel de Vide. "The wind calls my name. I dare not answer. I dare not speak." And then funny enough, I was driving around for Uber Eats this morning and I heard 3 different songs with 3 different references to the Call of the Void. One of them was by a dude called I Am Jake Hill. great artist. The song is called Void Walker, and he mentions the call of the void. So check it out if you haven't. Listen to Black Tongue, amazing. And then a lot of the songs were EDM, which nothing wrong with EDM, but no lyrics to reference. And then the next thing I did, I went on to IMDb and I searched for both The Call of the Void and Lapel de Vide. Um, take a guess. Take a guess how many different. So they list movies, they list shorts, they list podcasts. How many references do you think there were?
I would say probably over 50.
Dude, you're dead on. 50, roughly 50 different pieces between multiple movies, tons of shorts, tons of podcasts, all referencing The Call of the Void. It's wild. It's wild how it's like I'm sure there's a name for it, but it's that phenomenon where like you discover that this car exists that you've never seen before, and you're like, oh, that's a cool car. I've never seen that. And then for the next week straight, you see a dozen of them a day, right? I'm gonna hear The Call of the Void everywhere I go now as a result.
Yeah, it's
And
kind
so are
of
you.
yeah. It's kind of like you buy that car and you're like, I don't see this often. And then the second you buy that car, like you're passing by them every 5 minutes on the road.
Yep. I experienced that exact thing when I got the car I drive now, right? I was looking into getting a car, and I settled on a Honda Pilot, a specific, 2012 to 2015 body style. And while I was looking for it to purchase, um, God, a dozen a day, man, a dozen a day. And I swear I'd never seen that car before in my life. It was crazy. It was crazy.
Yeah,
But yeah,
maybe,
that's the call of the void.
yeah, and yeah, maybe it's you don't look for it until you know it. And then once you know it and you own it, and then it becomes something personal, then
Yep,
you start to correlate with it and you start to
totally.
see it.
I think that's what's one of the things that's so cool about doing a podcast in general, but specifically a podcast like this, where we're picking out topics that are maybe not as well known, right? Again, another podcast I listen to, one of their main goals is, um, to give you these tidbits of information, so that if you're sitting at a dinner party, right, or sitting at Thanksgiving dinner or out at a bar with friends, and somebody mentions something, like for example, last week, right? You mentioned Abercrombie and Fitch. Oh, did you know that, Ernest Hemingway bought the shotgun that he used to unalive himself from Abercrombie and Fitch, right? These little tidbits of knowledge. So now, when you or any of the listeners are out hanging out with friends, and, they go hiking and they're standing on the edge of something, they could say, do you feel the call of the void? And they can talk about it. That's super, super cool.
Yeah, I've never heard of it. It's very interesting, and I can definitely relate to how those thought processes can be perceived. But now I didn't know there was a name behind it, which is interesting. That's cool. Something to check out on. And then, um, I mean, obviously, like Ty said, if you're having some of these thoughts and it's more towards feeling of acting. Like Ty said, 988.
988.
Yeah.
Yes. And please, like, I know personally, the biggest thing that I have to remind myself is I'm not alone. And I would rather talk about it, even if it doesn't end up meaning anything, than keep it in and risk something happening, right? Because we all deserve to be happy. We all deserve love. We all deserve kindness. We all deserve peace. And that can be found for each and every one of us. We just need to speak up.
Yep. Speak up. Get help. Talk to a therapist. Talk to a close friend, family member.
Talk to us. I'll be on Twitch right after this, streaming some video games.
Yeah.
Come hang out.
So it's always good to talk and get it out and to clear the air, because if it's just in your head, it tends to get worse. You need to get the information out.
Definitely.
But yeah, definitely interesting to have a word behind it. But like you said, there are movies, there are songs, and personally, for me, when songs can be an outlet, and especially in today's world, music vibrancy. I mean, music alone can change a chemical imbalance in your brain. It's a study; it's proven. Depending on what you're listening to, it's kind of like if you're angry, you listen to heavy metal, and it kind of gets that it gets it out, right? Or you can't sleep, so you listen to these certain sounds, right? There's certain songs that are upbeat and happy, and they give you a boost in serotonin. Because of how our brains work, I don't really know the scientific formula behind it, but your sensors in your brain, it triggers them. It's certain parts of your brain, and presents a different feeling or thought process. So that's cool for anybody listening. I recommend that too. Music is therapy sometimes. Listening to people talk about it is therapy. Understanding that other people have these issues, um, and just knowing that there are different outlets that you can have to fill the void.
Absolutely.
Well, I mean, as far as Call the Void goes, do you have anything else to add?
I'm satisfied, man. I feel good. I feel like my cold, my congestion has allowed me a decent amount of information and speech, and I'm satisfied with today.
Awesome. Well, everybody, thanks for watching. For those of you that are viewing this after the live, we are working on to make sure that we have a consistent Monday or Tuesday schedule. We're still figuring it out. The podcast is still new. Please bear with us. But luckily, these videos are posted after the fact on YouTube for your viewing pleasure. This is our third episode, so starting next week, you'll be able to start listening to our podcasts on Spotify and Apple Music, and I believe like 3 or 4 other platforms. Whether you like to see it live, you like to interact, or you just want to listen to it in your car, or just on a set of headphones while you're doing something else. So that is coming soon. I just want to get 4 episodes deep before we started releasing those on an audio basis. But thank you for watching. Thank you for viewing live. Live or not, we appreciate your views. Again, you can find us on Twitter at Empty World PC. We are on Twitter. Again, if you like our content, subscribe. Different subject each week. Next one, I'll have some very uh, very heavy thinking subject for Ty. It's not going to be related to mental health. We're gonna skip over that. Last week we did empty places. Next week I'm going to do something else that is really uh, a brain teaser, I guess you can say. But it'll be very light mooded. Um, so everybody, I appreciate you listening. If you have comments, please submit them in the comment section. Subscribe. Follow us on Twitter, and we hope to bring very many more episodes, whether it be into the human psyche or just be empty places in the world or other voids that we may experience throughout our lives. But with that said, again, I'm Mason. Ty.
And I'm Ty. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for joining, and we will catch you next week. Have a great day.